hidden in plain sight.
Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of Hidden in Plain Sight, the podcast that delves deeper and deeper into the life of Christopher Marlowe, his works, and the people around him. Together we will see if we can explore and fill in some of the gaps that exist in the traditional narratives about this famed Elizabethan playwright. If you're completely new to us, do go back and check out our first and second series of the podcast. And why not pick up a copy of Marlowe's Complaint, the book that started it all? With me in glorious living color, as usual, are my dear friends Peter Hodges and Carol Paxton. Welcome back, guys.
Hello again.
Well, guys, we made it to Season 3. What do you think of that?
Remarkable.
Yeah. Yeah, well, nothing makes me happier than to sit and talk about Christopher Marlowe all day long. So, no complaints here.
Well, I want to look at some of the things that we talked about before. Peter, in the first season, you outlined your theories about how the sonnets were actually written by Christopher Marlowe. But before we go any further, I think it would be very, very useful for our listeners to understand actually what a sonnet is. Where did it come from? How did it develop? How did it make its merry way to England and then get attributed traditionally to William Shakespeare?
Right. Well, at the very beginning, it's a poem. And anybody who has studied English might remember that it's a particular type of poem. It's composed of 3 quatrains, that's 4 lines, and a final couplet, which is usually a rhyming couplet, and which, if you like, sums up what's gone before. And most people think sonnets are something to do with Shakespeare. In fact, if you say sonnet, people will probably say Shakespeare. And if you ask for an example, I would make a reasonably sized bet that they would start off, "Shall I compare thee to a summer's day?" Everybody knows that one. Mick Jagger recited it at a concert in Hyde Park not so many years ago. But in fact, sonnets didn't originate in England, and they certainly didn't originate with Shakespeare. They started in Italy back at the very beginning of the Renaissance in the 13th century. They then spread across Europe through all the Romance languages, if you like, to Spain, to Portugal, to France, and eventually ended up in England via the sonnets of Petrarch. And Petrarch is, in a way, the sonneteer, and with Petrarchian sonnets very much associated with love poetry, Petrarch and Laura being one of the great historical love stories, although the reality was perhaps a little less wonderful, and ended up in the court of Henry VIII, where Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, and Sir Thomas Wyatt both experimented with the form. And a few of their sonnets ended up in a very famous publication, 1557, Toffle's Miscellany, which really is, if you like, the golden treasury of early 16th century verse. And at that point, I suppose people wrote them, but there's no upsurge in activity until the 1580s, when Thomas Watson, I think we've talked about Thomas Watson quite a bit before, published a book called The Passionate Century of Love, which he claimed was a book of sonnets, although they're actually all 18-line poems. But about that time, and certainly before his death in 1587, Philip Sidney wrote a cycle of sonnets, very Petrarchian, called Astrophones and Stella. Stella is perhaps Penelope Rich, the Earl of Essex's sister. And those sonnets were passed around in manuscript and eventually reached publication 1590, 1591, and in what might well have been a pirated edition. And all of a sudden, hey presto, sonnets are the thing. Everybody's writing sonnets. Some of them are pretty dreadful, but some of them are actually also really rather good. They are the fashionable form of the moment. And so it stayed for the next 20 years or so, although by 1600, certainly, if not a bit before, people were starting to become rather fed up with them. They were too fashionable, too many people were writing them, and people start writing parodies. Nothing Like the Sun, for example, is obviously a parodic sonnet. And I think I've said enough now.
Well, that is actually a fascinating insight into what a sonnet is. And I think people who are listening to our podcast might actually have learned something new there, because I certainly did. And I think this is a good way for us to segue back into our first season, where Peter, I think we should start our story there. Tell us again what you think was going on. I mean, why would anyone decide to write the sonnets that were attributed to William Shakespeare? I mean, weren't they just a collection of love poems?
Well, I do think they were more than that. I think they were a stage in the competition between Burleigh and Essex. Now, what do I mean by that? If we're looking at the first set of sonnets in the total collection, the first question we have to ask ourselves is, why were these written specifically? Generally, there are the first 17 sonnets that appear to be aimed at a person who is expected to marry, or someone is trying to convince him to marry. And the purpose of the sonnets is to tell him what the benefits of marriage would be. One of the chief benefits being, you'll have children who will be as beautiful as you and your parents were when they were young. And God forbid you should get old without having beautiful examples of yourself left behind for us to appreciate. This is really the subject of those first 17 sonnets. Now, when we look at this competition between Burleigh and Essex, why would these sonnets come into play? Why would they have anything to do with getting someone married, and why would Burleigh care about that? The simple answer is, there is no simple answer. The simple answer is, in 1590, at the very beginning of the rage for sonnets, Francis Walsingham passed away. He was the head of the intelligence service, and it was a very expensive operation to run. When Lord Burleigh took over the intelligence service, he needed to find money to run the service.
Or hang on, I always thought Lord Burleigh was one of the richest men in England.
Well, he was, but he was cheap. And he didn't like to spend his own money if he could help it.
Neither did Elizabeth.
Neither did Elizabeth, exactly. And so rather than empty his own coffers, which was something that Walsingham had done to his great sorrow, Burleigh could look ahead and see that if he were to compete with Essex, who was landed and an earl and could collect rents and had a near infinite store of money, he was going to lose in that competition. So he needed something similar to offset Essex's advantages. And it so happened that there was a young man who was a ward in Burleigh's house, who was in fact the heir to the richest, the greatest amount of wealth in all of England. And this would have been the Earl of Southampton, a young man of 17 whose father had passed away and who had inherited this gigantic estate, which was being managed at the time by Lord Burleigh. And Burleigh also had a granddaughter of marriageable age. And if he could put these two people together, he would be able to tap into the Southampton fortune, which would then give him the advantage over Essex in the intelligence world. This all seems like a very odd reason to get people married, but really, this is why marriages are set up in the upper classes in order to preserve and transfer wealth. And so this would have been Burleigh's interest. And in fact, he sat down and made some notes in his personal diary about how soon, how old, for instance, Southampton was. At one point, he noted he was 16 and he was going to turn 17 in October. And he then began having correspondence with Southampton's aunt and uncle and his mother about the idea of having this marriage arranged. And as it happens, these family members did attempt to twist the young man's arm, but he didn't go for it. And so Burleigh needed to find some other way of making his case. Well, I don't know where the idea came to him that he could give this fellow poems that might plead his case, but somewhere along the way he did. Now, it so happens that working for Lord Burleigh was a man named Thomas Watson, who Carol just mentioned. And he was one of the people who had brought the idea of sonneteering to England. And he was also a student of Italian madrigals, and he was a translator. And he had, in fact, given a gift of 100 sonnets, as he called them, to the Earl of Oxford. And the Earl of Oxford, it so happens, was the father of the granddaughter that Burleigh wanted to get married to the Earl of Southampton. So this is a very tight circle of people. And as Burleigh is scratching his head, his forehead, trying to figure out where he's going to find the money to run the intelligence operation that is so necessary to the Queen, and he's got a young man by the name of Tom Watson who is keeping an eye on the Cornwallis household to make sure that these Catholic tied people don't get out of control. Conversations take place. What do you think? Would a gift like what you gave to Oxford, do you think that would have any impact on a young man like Southampton? I don't know. What do you think? Well, yeah, that's possible. I don't know. I wouldn't mind that commission. Well, I'm not so sure I want to give you that commission, but I'm looking for someone. Who do you think? Should I give it to Oxford? Do you think Oxford would be the man? Has he ever done anything like this? Oh, I don't know. You'd have to ask him. That's a conversation that may have happened, may not have happened.
Oh, that's interesting. So, are you going to look at the possibility that the Earl of Oxford, Edward de Vere, might have anything to do with these sonnets instead of Christopher Marlowe?
Well, Carol, you pointed out to me the other day that there was a sonnet written by the Earl of Oxford. Is that true?
It might be, yes. There is a sonnet which was identified as back in the 19th century as being by the Earl of Oxford. It certainly exists in various manuscript forms. It was published in not anonymously in an anthology called The Tears of Fancy. But whether it is by Oxford is, well, a little difficult to be certain, although, as I say, various people have attributed to him. The other thing that we have to say about it is it's not entirely wonderful as sonnets go. It basically consists of 12 questions and a rhyming couplet to finish it off. Does anybody want to read it? I'm not very good at that, so maybe you should do that, Peter.
I think I could take a stab at some part of it. Let me see here. This is the sonnet attributed to Oxford. Who taught thee first to sigh, alas, my heart? Who taught thy tongue the woeful words of plaint? Who filled your eyes with tears of bitter smart? Who gave thee grief and made thy joys to faint? Who first did paint with colors pale thy face? Who first did break thy sleeps of quiet rest? Above the rest in court, who gave thee grace? Who made thee strive in honor to be best? In constant truth, to bide so firm and sure, to scorn the world regarding but thy friends, with patient mind each passion to endure, in one desire to settle to the end. Love then thy choice wherein such choice thou bind, as naught but death may ever change thy mind. That's not actually so bad, is
No,
it?
it's not terrible. It's not terrible.
If Oxford wrote that, we wouldn't have to be ashamed to hand that over.
No, I mean it is.
I'm not sure I'd want to read 17 of them just like
no. It's a perfectly competent piece of poetry. I mean, I should talk. I don't think I could write anything like that, but it's hardly gold star stand.
Well, one of the things I noticed in this was, and what we look for in a sonnet, the first 8 stanzas usually set out the case, and then the next 4 do a kind of spin on it or reversal or complicate it. And I see that happening here. So that's not, he's not fumbling around. Whoever this is, and it is also true that there's at least one sonnet in the sonnets attributed to Shakespeare that is basically a series of questions, very much like this. And then there's another one where he just complains, all in couplets. So, if this is the only example we have, we could sit here and say, well, that's not up to the par of all the others. But we don't know what else this person may or may not have done. So, but didn't you also point out to me that Marlowe wrote a sonnet?
Well, there are 2, one of which is absolutely definitely there, and the other of which is a slightly shaky attribution. And the one which is absolutely definitely there is actually in Tamburlaine. In Act 5 of Tamburlaine 1, the Virgins of Damascus scene, there's a very famous speech which starts off effectively as a hymn of praise by Tamburlaine to Xenocrates, divine Xenocrates, and goes on. It's a very, very long speech, but embedded in the middle of it are 14 lines, which, to be honest, aren't really part of the theme of the speech, the hymn of praise to Xenocrates. They are more in, well, I think you could almost call it a poetic manifesto. It's why am I a poet? What is poetry? And it's a sonnet attempting to answer that question. Again, the floor is yours.
Well, let's take a stab at it if I can render this. So this is the Tamburlaine sonnet written by Christopher Marlowe. What is beauty, saith my sufferings then? If all the pens that poets ever held had fed the feeling of their master's thoughts, and every sweetness that inspired their hearts, their minds, and muses on admired themes, if all the heavenly quintessence they still from their immortal flowers of poesy, wherein, as in a mirror, we perceive the highest reaches of a human wit, if all these had made one poem's period, and all combined in beauty's worthiness, yet should there hover in their restless heads one thought, one grace, one wonder at the least, which into words no virtue can digest. Well, that's pretty good. I like that. I mean,
I think it's very good indeed.
Sorry, but that's pretty good. If I'm Lord Burleigh and you throw those 2 at me, I'm going with the number 2. I'm saying, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, coming back then, because you mentioned 17 poems, the first 17 sonnets, I should say, then is there any connection? Because you also mentioned the age of the Earl of Southampton. He was 16 and about to turn 17. Was there some connection then between the numbers?
It does seem to me, at least, that the 17 is a very significant number. I mean, it's a prime, but more than that, Burleigh has a clock ticking on his ability to negotiate with Southampton. As his ward, Southampton must remain under Burleigh's control until he's 21. And so he's got 4 years to convince this young man to follow the path that he's outlining. And he's clearly outlined this path because, again, let's remind ourselves, he's had correspondence with his family and has answered Burleigh, essentially, by way of his family, to say, thanks for the compliment, I'm not getting married today. And so if Burleigh is launching into this position of trying to advocate this more formally to the boy, the year 17 is the linchpin. Now, there's another thing that we want to keep in mind here, because do we know that Burleigh actually made overtures directly to the Earl? And it is the case that when he turned 18 years old, Burleigh had his personal secretary, John Clapham, thank you for that correction, Carol, John Clapham, write a poem called Narcissus, which, taking on the theme of the young man who was so enamored of his own image that he fell into a pool and drowned as a result. That was the gift that he made to him on his 18th birthday. So we know that Burleigh actually asked for his secretary to make this gift, this very type of gift, to the Earl of Southampton when he was a youth, following the purpose of marrying him off to Elizabeth de Vere, Burleigh's granddaughter. That's just true. So did he then commission 17 sonnets for this same purpose to be offered to him on his 17th birthday? When we look at all of the things that are in play, when we look at the fact that sonnets have become all the rage by 1590, and we look at the people who are participating in that exercise of writing sonnets, being the Earl of Oxford and Tom Watson, who came over from Italy and helped introduce the form, and Philip Sidney, who was the inspiration for poets, wrote the defense of poetry, and was everybody's, I want to say, saint of poetry for all of England. Yes,
and especially after his death. I mean, he was the perfect knight beforehand, and now he's almost the martyr.
A giant funeral, and everybody thinks of Philip Sidney as the absolute emblem of chivalry and poetry at the same time. And then you have Christopher Marlowe, who is the superstar, who has written Tamburlaine. And, well, making a gift of sonnets would not be altogether inappropriate. You wouldn't look stupid doing it. You would look pretty smart doing it. And for Lord Burleigh to commission this from a poet of renown, it would only be a question of which one he wants to choose.
So would you have any evidence, Peter, that Lord Burleigh selected Marlowe as the writer of these 17 sonnets?
I wouldn't.
He's working for him.
Well, he's working for him, yes.
As did Clapham.
I don't know. Are you leading me somewhere? The only thing I can say is that we've just named 4 people. One of them is dead. Okay, Philip Sidney. Now we've got 3 other people. We've got the Earl of Oxford. I suppose you could say Edmund Spenser, but I'm not even sure Edmund Spenser wrote any sonnets. So now we've got 3 people. Who's going to impress this boy the most? The man who gave the Earl of Oxford a gift of sonnets? The man who received that gift and who wrote a sonnet that we know of, who happens to be the father of the bride, who might have one might suspect his motives in trying to convince this very rich man to marry his daughter, or the number one playwright of the day, who is very popular with his crowd, who is the closest in age to young Southampton, who represents his own generation and probably knows him.
Well, they overlapped at Cambridge, didn't they?
Yes. And
Yes.
so why not? We know the sonnets got written. And the question is, when did they get written? When would they do the most use for the person who was to request them as a gift for another? They would be most useful as 17 specific sonnets to go to this 17-year-old hyper-rich young man who has already been singled out as marriageable by the Secretary of State and the Lord Treasurer of England. So those are the circumstances surrounding this mysterious creation of these 17 sonnets. And I'm going to say it all points in the same direction. I will grant you, at this stage of our investigation of these sonnets, of the whole 154, and just looking at these first 17, we pretty much can only say we have a person of interest. And that person would be Christopher Marlowe, because we know he was there, we know he was writing sonnets, and we know Burleigh had a need, and he had an employee, being Christopher Marlowe, who could fill that need. That's the case thus far.
So that is the QED for this episode. I think this is a good time to end this episode. And when we come back, we're going to explore the sonnets even further. Join us again for our next episode of Hidden in Plain Sight.
Hidden in